Hello and welcome to Global Order. My name is Ishan Dhar. Tibet is often thought of as a monolithic Buddhist whole. This is, however, far from the case. There were other minority communities, such as the Tibetan Muslims. The story of the Tibetan Muslims is unique, for not only is it about communities that arose between nations that suddenly found themselves thrust into the Westphalian world in the middle of the 20th century, but their story also provides an interesting validation of India's sovereignty over Jammu and Kashmir. Joining me today to discuss this story in detail is a notable member of the Tibetan Muslim community, Mr. Syed Ahmad Baba, who is a distinguished former bureaucrat who served India both at home and abroad. Stay tuned to find out why this history is relevant to us Indians. Mr. Baba, thank you very much for joining us. We truly appreciate you sparing your time and discussing this niche but very relevant topic.
Thank you.
Mr. Baba, when one reads about the Tibetan Muslims, granted there are not many texts, but in the few texts that are available, one often comes across the term Khache or sometimes Lhasa Khache. What is the etymology of this term and how is it connected to the Tibetan Muslims?
All right. Thank you, Ishan. Yeah, you are right. Not many people know about this ethnic group called Tibetan Muslims. Tibetan Muslims is basically a anglicized term. Very short, briefly, Muslims lived in Tibet, in particular the capital of Tibet, Lhasa, and Shigaje, the second city.
Right.
Now, in Tibetan, we are called the Phoba Khaji. Phoba means Tibetan. And Khaji is a very interesting term. It is also a word in the Kashmiri language. And the origins are called the Khaji Yul, the land which is on the western part of the Tibet.
Right.
So those days the land meant Kashmir, Ladakh, Baltistan, all those areas. Now I don't know if you've been to Leh and Kargil or
I
not.
have.
So you have.
I have.
So if you hang around the main city center of Leh and you have the palaces and all, and then you can visualize Leh those days was a very important gateway both to Tibet as well as to India. So it was the center of trade where the traders came not only from Tibet but from Central Asia, especially Xinjiang, and then you have the Jammu area, even Himachal area. So they all merged there, did their trading part. So the Khajiyul became the word to identify a territory which was on the western side, and in particular, it meant Kashmir, including Baltistan, Ladakh, all those places. So, origins of Tibetan Muslims are from these traders who not only used to come from Kashmir to Leh, but from Leh onwards, these assembly of traders from different regional countries or areas would also go to Tibet. Now, initially, the route to Tibet, in particular to Lhasa, was not there. So there was a particular popular, let's say, market which was on the borders of Tibet as well as Ladakh. So slowly, when the route started opening up, traders became felt safer, and of course, there was more profitable. So they started making entry right up to the Lhasa, and you can say it was a auxiliary part of the Silk Road. Now, these are the traders. When you go to Tibet, imagine the distance from Leh to. If you look at the map, it's a big blank space
Right.
that's called the Changthang. For example, a lot of tourists nowadays go to what lake is called Pengong Lake.
Hang so
So Pengong Lake. Beyond Pengong Lake, and you will understand the terrain from Ladakh itself. It's very hostile and it's not an easy route to follow. And of course, those days there wasn't route. So this entire area from traveling from Leh to, let's say, Lhasa would be, I would say, what, 500 miles or so. Now, this was the time when Tibet, during the 7th, 8th century, Tibet was an empire. So 7th, 8th century is the historically you had empires, the Chinese, the Tibetan Empire, you have the Arabs, you have the Persians. So they were either alliances or they were foes. So a lot of battles and wars used to take place. And very interesting, our Tibetan community, I'll very briefly say,
Right.
one group, the main group are descendants from these traders who went and lived in Lhasa. And interestingly, a small segment of our community, we call them Singba Khajis. Singba
Oh,
means a turbaned person. So now what had happened was 1841, when General Joravar Singh was killed in the battle with the Tibetans. Many of the Joravar Singh's soldiers were taken as prisoners and they were taken right up to Lhasa all as prisoners. So later, when there was an amnesty, they were given the option either you want to go back, you are free to go back. If you want to settle down in Lhasa, you are okay to do it. So some of the soldiers who were in Lhasa as prisoners, they also decided to settle down. So they also slowly became merged with the main Tibetan Muslim community. Now, this community, obviously, we have to distinguish one of your questions also there that it is different from the Chinese Muslims.
correct.
So the Chinese Muslims terms we use is Hui, Havalinga, uh, clearly distinguishable. Now, again, another group of Muslims in Tibet used to be the Nepali Muslims. We call them Khachars. Similar in language, culture, they were also quite Tibetanized. And another group, of course, are the Ladakhi Muslims who lived in Tibet. So, this Tibetan Muslim, we call them our Lhasa Khaji. We are different and distinguishable from the Chinese, the Nepali Muslims, and the Ladakhi Muslims. So this, in brief, is the definition of who the Tibetan
Tibetan
Muslims
Muslims.
are.
Correct. And one often hears about a very unique relationship that this community had historically with the Dalai Lamas, I believe the fifth Dalai Lama onwards. What was this relationship like historically, and what is the relationship like in contemporary times with His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama?
All right. Yeah, just to go back a little more, now you can imagine the traders who were going to Tibet. It wasn't, as I said, it wasn't an easy route. It wasn't a short road. It would
Right,
take months, 3, 4 months by mule to reach Lhasa and go back. So it became necessary for a trader to have a store, a warehouse in Lhasa.
right,
So a warehouse was set up, and then severe winter conditions are there. For some reason, geographical or economic, many of them had to spend a couple of years in Tibet itself. They were not able to go back to where they came from, that is Kashmir or Ladakh. So they settled down there and obviously got married to Tibetan women. And this is how the genesis of this Tibetan Muslim community started. The traders had to stay back for a couple of years, and while staying back, they got married. Now, this trade phenomena, which started from as I described, from Ladakh onwards, this was started in the 12th century to 14th century. 12th to 17th century was the window when the trade was very popular between these two regions. All right. Now, fifth Dalai Lama. The fifth Dalai Lama uh, is was a remarkable person and a visionary. So, fifth Dalai Lama, his tenure was he lived 1616 to 1682. So this was the period when he was the Dalai Lama, a visionary person who realized, my understanding is that Tibet being so isolated and economically backward, need to interact with other neighboring regions so that not only the economic prosperity of Tibet will improve, but then there will be several rich cultural exchanges. So he was the one who proactively promoted trade and culture from neighboring countries. So his period is remembered as the period when the Tibet or when the Muslim traders from regional places, they were welcomed, and he is remembered also in our oral history to have given us a place to build our worship place of prayers, a graveyard, all those things. So fifth Dalai Lama was a very important personality in the history of Tibetan Muslims.
Right.
This continued after fifth Dalai Lama. Another Dalai Lama would be the 13th Dalai Lama. 13th Dalai Lama was also another such personality who was a visionary and who promoted multiculturalism and trade. Now comes our present His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. So, like 5th and 13th Dalai Lama, he is also very close to the Tibetan Muslims. And if you have seen photographs and news, whenever he gets an opportunity, whenever he visits the place where Tibetan Muslims are there, he makes it a point to uh, invite them to meet him. So, be it in Kashmir, be it in Ladakh, recently, a year or 2 years back, when he goes to Darjeeling, there are some Tibetan Muslims there. He makes it a point. So, now I would say that His Holiness the present Dalai Lama, whenever he meets or he speaks about us, he emphasizes on one important point to mean that these Tibetan Muslims, their ancestors may be foreigners, but then we should not forget that over the years in Tibet, they became assimilated with our community. They are as Tibetan as we Tibetan Buddhists are. And then he admires a lot and he tells his Tibetan followers, look at our Tibetan Muslim brothers and sisters, the language of Tibet, because today the challenge before the Tibetan community is to how to preserve their language and culture, right? After 1960. So he often refers to the language, Tibetan language spoken by the Tibetan Muslims, and thanks them for having preserved this rich language, in particular the Lhasa dialect, where our Tibetan spoken is, would say, more refined and it would sound very sweet. So he admires this quality of having preserved this language even after 60, 65 years now.
Correct. However, interestingly, despite this assimilation, I mean, once you had the Chinese invasion in the middle of the 20th century, the bulk of this community, after the uprising, the Tibetan uprising in 1959, the bulk of this community came to India not as Tibetan refugees, but as Indian citizens, sort of a distinct uh, category, I suppose, from the rest of the Tibetans who came. Under what circumstances did this happen? And was this a shift? Did the Tibetan Muslims always think of themselves as Indian? Could you tell us more about this?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a very important point of debate. Now,
Right.
historically, what had happened was when the Chinese came, the Tibetan Muslims, like their brothers and sisters in the Tibetan Buddhism, they are very pious people. They are simple folks, but very pious. I don't mean to say fundamentalists or very religious. They would be honest, simple, and very pious in their belief and practice. Now, if you recall the history of how the Chinese came, 1951, 52, and then for till 1959, they behaved very well. Uh, but then everything turned around after that incident in March before the Norbulinga, when His Holiness had to leave the country.
Right.
Now thereafter, the I don't know. I'm a student of political science, so when you read communism in the college universities, one of the popular phrases of communism was that, apart from dialectical materialism, they would say religion is the opium of people. All right, whether
Right.
we agree or not, but then this was a popular phrase of communism, in particular Chinese communism, when they started in China. That opium, religion is the opium of people. Now, our folks, simple minded, when they heard or when they were told that your religion is an opium of people, you can understand they were really terrified. That how could you live with such aggressors or rulers who decide that your religion is not worth it, or your religion is an opium, you should discard it. That gave the fright, and there was no way you could leave and continue to practice your religion. That was prime Tibetan Muslims. You may have all the economic prosperity, but then if you're not allowed to, then it's not worth living in this country. This is how the exodus, the thought of exodus, leaving the country started. Now, very interestingly, now uh, Indian government, the Indian government in the 1959-60 was very helpful to this community. In particular, there were two consul generals of Tibet in Lhasa. I remember the name Mr. Chibber, and then it was Mr. P. K. Paul. All right. Now our elders went and met them and said, "This is our predicament. Now, please help us how to go about that." So they connected the history of Tibetan Muslim ancestors having come from India. That's a fact. And therefore, taking this link, the Indian government supported and requested Chinese government to allow this community, because their ancestors had come from Tibet for trading Lhasa, which is a historical fact. And now, in the changed circumstances, they would like to go back to their motherland. So
Right.
this is how the Indian government helped in approaching the Chinese about our community. Now, interestingly, the Chinese government, after having examined our profile and records and all, they said, no, nothing. They are not your Indian subjects, they are Chinese subjects, meaning they are Tibetans. And you have a very interesting exchange of correspondence between the two sides.
Right.
And from the Indian side, when they write to the Chinese side, they would cite instances to to substantiate their point that they are Indians, and the Chinese would do the same. You know, so ultimately, I think there was a political solution to this stalemate, which continued for more than a year, and finally they relented, agreed, and that is how we came. And so we were allowed to come in as repatriates. So Indian Citizenship Act, there's
Right.
a particular provision where you could be repatriated. So we were repatriated as Indian citizens back to the motherland, which belong to our ancestors. This is, in brief, is the story.
And I understand that most of the community ended up in Kashmir. Uh, I don't know if that's still the case. So
Yes.
how and why did this happen?
Uh, yes, I think it's very simple that our elders wanted to, when once they were allowed to come to India, so they wanted to reconnect with the roots of their ancestors, Kashmir being the place. They opted for Kashmir, and this is how the Kashmir government, the then Kashmir government, with the government of India, they facilitated their initial settlements. So those logistic supports were given initially, and the people of Kashmir were also very warm, welcomed them as if they are, their people who had gone to Tibet. Now, this is how Kashmir was chosen. Although Darjeeling, Kalimpong are also places where some of them decided to settle down in Darjeeling, Kalimpong, and of course, some in Nepal also.
Right. And what were conditions like for this community in Kashmir specifically at the time? I understand that despite um, coming back to India as Indian nationals, citing their Kashmiri heritage, permanent resident or state subject status remained elusive for many years. And it was only after 2019, with Article 370, I guess, being dissolved, that domicile status was given. Can you tell us more about this?
Ishan, yeah, there are two parts, two sides of the story. One is that, of course, the 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 rules of the act did not enable or allowed Tibetan Muslims who had come to Kashmir to leave such a right of domicile. So I think there were legal hurdles to give it to them. And second side is that I remember as a child when the Exodus 1960 when they came to India, Ishan, such exodus of Dalai Lama, this was not the first time. Earlier in history, in recent history, in the 1921, perhaps, again, the Dalai Lama, 13th Dalai Lama, had to flee Tibet and take shelter in India, along with many of his followers. And when the turmoil subsided back in Tibet, they again went back. So this happened twice before.
Right,
Our folks, especially the women's side, the women or the belief, general belief in the community was we came in the 1959 60. Maybe this Chinese takeover or aggression is a temporary phenomena, like it happened 30 years ago. We may have to go back again. See, the longing was when you have completely Tibetanized, uh, your longing would be always to go back to Tibet, which you consider as the motherland. And since such temporary shifting had happened in the recent past, in the recent memory, they thought they have to go back.
right,
So maybe for one reason that most of the people who came over had a thought in their minds, maybe this is a temporary arrangement. We may have to go back. So this is how they were perhaps also not keen to go for this state subject, and which had, of course, many advantages they could not avail of because of they didn't have it. For example, higher education, maybe employment,
right.
land ownership, etc.
Correct. And even many years after many of these communities have been exiled, one still hears about the People's Republic of China often harassing what it perceives to be dissidents abroad. So one hears about Tibetans as well as Uyghurs undergoing surveillance, etc., sometimes worse. Has the Tibetan Muslim community in India and elsewhere experienced such treatment or no?
I don't know, Ishan, because this is a very sensitive question. I really have, as a personal knowledge,
Right,
I don't have, and I hope we don't have what do you call surveillance on us by others.
right,
But yeah, back in 15 and 60, when the Chinese were now very determined to hold a ironclad hold on the Tibetan, and when our elders were refusing to sort of follow them or comply them, so we were also harassed then, put under surveillance, imprisoned, and there was a food boycott for our community. Nobody was allowed to sell any food to us, and every morning or every night, in the middle of the night, they would come, knock doors, search your house, randomly arrest you. Those mental trauma they had gone through for more than a year. And what I heard from my elders is that those days, yes, there were a couple of our own people who were colluding with the authorities then and giving them all the informations. They, of course, stayed back. They didn't come to India with the main community. It happened in Tibet those days, but in recent times, I don't have any information, and I hope such things are not happening.
What has the community's engagement in contemporary times been like with the Central Tibetan administration or the Tibetan government in exile? Do you see a lot of engagement? Would you like it to be greater? What are your thoughts?
Yes, like I said, the community and His Holiness Dalai Lama, and with along with his exile government in exile, are we are very closely interacting for the past 50 years or so, and certain those cooperation in the field of skills training, education, and many some of it's very interesting when His Holiness Dalai Lama came over to India in the 60s when he set up his office. He was in need of young people who could speak both Tibetan as well as Hindi and English also. Obviously, they would not know any language other than Tibetan.
You
Now you
you
have
needed
to
a trilingual staff fundamentally.
exactly. So, like my own brother, he was a student of Delhi. He could speak Tibetan, write Tibetan, speak in Hindi and English also. Like him, he, along with his contemporaries from our community who were students and who were educated, worked with Dalai Lama's office in Dharamsala for many years as interpreters and translators. So this was quite a very interesting relationship we had. Similarly, Ishan, if you read old books, 200, 300 years back, uh, books written by the British authors describing their journey or interaction with the government, Tibetan government, you'll find that the letters which were addressed by Dalai Lama those days to the British government were all in Persian, Farsi, you see. And this is translated, Farsi was the court language in India. Now, Dalai Lama would sign or with his emblem a letter which was written by him in Persian, Farsi. So, now the question was that who would be there in a country, place like Lhasa, Tibet, knowing Farsi, writes Farsi? So it's got to be those Tibetan Muslims who knew Urdu as well as Farsi to read and write. So we had those interpreters in the office of Dalai Lama back in Lhasa 200, 300 years ago also. Now, apart from this, what is needed now today? To bridge the gap between now you are the, let's say this is the third generation of Tibetan Muslims living in India. They are not as exposed or aware of the history or their relationship with the Tibetan Buddhist fraternity. So they have to be educated and told that way back till 1960, we lived as brothers and sisters among the Tibetan community. We are part of them. So today, this is now missing. At least Tibetan Buddhists would know, okay. Many of the Tibetan Buddhists also, they would not know that among the Tibetans, there's a community called Tibetan Muslims also. So the purpose of this website, as well as my Facebook and this kind of social media, is to have new generation of both Tibetan Muslims, Tibetan Buddhist youngsters in our group, so that they get to know each other. This is an awareness, and apart from preservation of language and culture, this is also important to remind or to inform the young generation that in the recent till the recent past in Tibet, we live together as in a harmonious society.
On that note, Mr. Baba, that was most insightful. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.